So I want to talk about newspapers more. So I was talking about how like mainly newspapers in the early 1800s were largely focused on um, more business news, more boring stuff. There were a few efforts to come up like by Benjamin Day with a 1 cent newspaper that would be easily purchased by like working class people. But it wasn't until 1883 that there was William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Joseph Pulitzer owned the Post-Dispatch out of St. Louis, and there's a prize called the Pulitzer Prize named for him. And what Pulitzer and Hearst are really known for is they decided to take the newspaper from being predominantly a item for business people and making it a item for the working class person, somebody getting off and just wanting news that they weren't just going to rely upon, it was going to have more news focused on that. And so what they did is they began to put in graphics, illustrations, photos if they could, but they also began to do things that were probably by most standards unethical in today's standard. Like they did media stunts, they would have big shows, and they would do kind of sensationalism and try to create stories. But one of the big things is they began to move the news to focusing on crime and personal interest. So before they wouldn't have covered crime in the same detail, but people like crime. I mean, if somebody's killed, people want to know what happened. People want to know what's going on, and so there was a big emphasis on crime reporting, and that became a big focus of the newspaper. And so what happens is this is a time when it came along that it became called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is a pretty common term. Yellow journalism is basically, the reason is they had the ability to put color on it. There was a cartoon that the papers that fell into this category were running called The Yellow Kid. And The Yellow Kid was just a cartoon, nothing really special about it, nothing political about it, nothing sensationalist. It just had a yellow kid. A kid who was yellow, and because of that, the newspapers that ran it were called the yellow papers or yellow journalists, and those papers became associated with kind of this more sensationalistic. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's hard news, people getting killed, but it's also soft news and stunts and anything that gets attention, gets people to go, hey, I want to watch that. And that's kind of way I think probably the equivalent would be like kind of your TV news, your constant puffery of it, your constant, you got to see this, you got to, like those kinds of, Dateline, come back to find out, here's we catch a predator, that kind of stunt journalism, and that was what it became focused on. That's kind of what a lot of us associate with newspapers. We don't kind of just associate as, okay, there's a list of, stock reports and what sold what and this kind of stuff. And even like, your more traditional newspapers have come around to, they cover crime, they cover people, they cover human interests, they cover things, they try to build a story, they try to sell the story, and that all came about as a result of Pulitzer. And it turned the newspaper from being predominantly a medium of the wealthy to being a medium for all people. As far as the newspaper still is fairly popular. Now, the statistics I have are a few years old, but there are around 46 million newspapers sold every day in the United States, both online and in print. I personally subscribe to an online version. That means I get I read it through a PDF online, basically, and it's a PDF. It's kind of a interactive PDF kind of program. It's a special program. If I do it on my iPad, I can, it's nice that way. I can do it on my phone. I can do it whatever. But it's kind of like it's its own way. And I look at the actual news pages and I click on the stories I want to read, and that's the way I do it. But there's still around 46 million sold either in digital format or print format. Around 46% of people still read the paper. 69% of people will at least read the paper once a week. So 70% of people, as of the statistics I had, are still doing it. The case is that is different from like World War II. Typically, there were 300 million people in the country back. If the newspaper sales were still the same, you'd be selling 350 to 400 million, because there were 11 newspapers in Chicago. People oftentimes bought a paper in the morning and a paper at noon, but they didn't have the TV, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have other ways of getting the news, and so that's what they did. Is at midday they wanted to know what had happened in the morning, they wanted to know what had happened overnight. The morning paper had to go to press at midnight, so they didn't have what happened between midnight and noon, but the paper that goes to press at 1 p.m. can, and so that paper would have the latest news. And so every so many hours you could buy a paper, and so people bought more than one paper per home, and the papers oftentimes get read by more than one person. Now, about a third of homes buy a paper, but of those papers that are bought by a third of homes, the average paper is read by like 2 to 3 people. And so that it does take up a significant number. There are 9,800 newspapers in the United States. 15% are dailies. The rest are weeklies or semi-weeklies, meaning twice a week or something like that. There are 130 million in subscription, circulation. But you have to remember, 85% of the market is not a daily paper, and so so 46 million of them are daily circulation. But then the other 84 million or whatever is they just people buy them once a week. So that's kind of the newspaper remains a fairly significant thing. People who buy newspapers tend to make more money. They tend to be professional, and so they're actually a very attractive group for advertisers. And that's one of the things that helps keep newspapers alive. That if you want to reach out to people who are doctors, lawyers, interested, professors, teachers, union workers, who make decent money, anybody who makes good money. I mean, because people who, if you're making minimum wage, a lot of times people don't read the paper at the same level of what they call a penetration rate. Penetration is the percentage of people who read in a given market. What level of penetration, how far into that market you get. That the penetration is lower as you go down the economic scale, but it's very high, almost 100% as you get up in the higher echelons, because a newspaper, while $10 a month may seem like a lot if you make minimum wage, if you make $250,000 or $500,000 a year, $10 a month for a newspaper, even if you don't read it, you throw it on, you throw it in the trash, and if you read it 5 times a month, you probably aren't that upset about the process. It was there when you wanted it, right? And you're willing to pay that. Now, most people who do it actually read it more often, though. And so, and because there's stuff about business, and there's stuff about government, and there's stuff about things, and so they buy it. And so what happens is that becomes, newspapers also only sell within a very limited geographic location. And they tend to, with a few exceptions, they tend to sell in a very limited geographic location. So if you're a local business, like you're you own a business that's only in Springfield, a restaurant or a bar or a clothing store or a shoe shining store, those are the people you are selling only to people. You're not paying for advertisements. They're going to go to people in Peoria. You're not paying for advertisements. They're going to go to people in Chicago. You're paying for people who are local. You're paying for people who have money. And so you're getting a very specific market. And so even though the newspaper sales have dropped, the audience is still very much of interest for people who are local and very much of interest for people who are perhaps in the market. And even things like for example, like if you're going to sell a car or a house or classified ads, they can be very pricey. But the reality is they do reach an audience that you want to reach. And so people are willing to pay. And that's what keeps newspapers alive. Most of their money is made off of advertising sales, not off circulation. And an ad in a newspaper can be fairly expensive, but that's where they make their money. They make their money off selling the ads. As far as newspapers go, there are the 3 largest newspapers are the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the USA Today. I think it's the New York Times. USA Today was first introduced in 1982, and people kind of saw it as kind of like the McPaper. It was kind of like this dumbed down, had graphics, lots of pictures, shorter stories, things like that. Nowadays, I think USA Today in the world of journalism is right on par, actually a very strong paper. But at the time, it was very highly criticized because it didn't feel like it did. But it's one of the bigger circulations, sells 1.4 million. Wall Street Journal sells around 1.5 million. And New York Times, I think, sells around 1 million copies. Washington Post is a strong daily, and it's a national one. But beyond that, most of the papers are not national. Most newspapers are local. And any national papers beyond that tend to have, even the national papers have very specific markets. USA Today has the market of travelers and business people. Wall Street Journal has business investors. people who own businesses, people who are interested in business, financiers, accountants, things like that. The New York Times has kind of maybe more of a cerebral academic side. People in politics. Washington Post is a political newspaper, although that is a local paper, but they do sell nationally. And so they all have different things. There's Financial Times and other things that are national, but newspapers by and large tend to be local. There are a lot of large daily newspapers, and some of the things that make them interesting is they do tend to have in large metropolitan dailies that, like in Chicago, they sell like one big paper, like Chicago Tribune or Chicago Sun-Times sells in the whole area. These tend to be bigger papers. They publish 5 times a day. They, these are kind of your bigger papers. They have zoned editions sometimes, which means that they have like they'll do one paper that goes out to like Central Illinois and the rest of Illinois and Indiana and Michigan and Ohio, or not Ohio, Wisconsin. And then they'll have like a suburban version, and then they'll have like a city version, and so they have different versions. They zone it, they'll change the news. So for example, one that's going to come to Central Illinois may have different stories than one that's going to go to the city. And that's kind of just a little bit of, how they do it. And so then you have your suburban and your small town, your suburban dailies. Probably the biggest of the suburban dailies is one called there's Long Island's Newsday, which is not really a city paper. It's focused on the island. But in Illinois, there's one called the Daily Journal. It's up in the Chicago suburbs. The Daily Herald, sorry, not the Daily Herald, the Daily Herald. And it actually, what they did is they made their market by zoning versions. They have like a version that goes like to south suburbs, like Tinley Park, version that goes to like west suburbs, Wheaton, southern, south, and then you have one that goes to like Oak Park, and then you have one that goes to like Park Ridge and Schaumburg, and one that goes to like your northern suburbs, your Palatine or your Libertyville. I don't know where Palatine is. Never mind. Libertyville, like that kind of area. And what they do is they actually have like 10 or 15 different ones. And so it's kind of like a local paper, because when you pick it up, the story on the front page is about the local council meeting here in your little suburb. But it has all the other suburbs around it on page 4 and 5, and then it doesn't have any of the other farther flung ones, but it has more Chicago city news and Illinois news and national news. And so they actually are one of the ones that were known best for zoning and having the ability to kind of sell well. And then you have your weeklies. These are things like like small weeklies, like all the little towns around here have one. Verdon, Girard, Auburn, Pawnee. I mean, they all have little weekly papers, and even the suburbs have little weekly papers, and those they come out once a week. They're all local. They're very much niche marketing, very much one specific thing. Now, sometimes there are weeklies that are topical, like they're about religion. The Catholics have a Catholic Times weekly, or that may be a bi-weekly. So there are other newspaper types, but those are they have a very specific market. There's ethnic newspapers, which become a very important and big part. There are 130 Spanish language papers that sell to 18% of the population, which is Latino in the United States. There are 250 African American newspapers. Those remain highly popular. There's one here in Springfield. There are 200 other foreign language newspapers. So the market for newspapers is very local, but there's also very much divided along interests or ethnic or other backgrounds, which allows for them to market niche marketing. There's also alternative newspapers, and alternative newspapers are things like like the Illinois Times is an alternative. It's usually a free weekly paper that's maybe focuses more on arts and entertainment or focuses more on politics, oftentimes with a liberal bent. And then there's what are called commuter papers, although I think those are going away, but used to, at the end of the workday, there would be papers like the Chicago Tribune would sell. There were a version of the paper that all they did was had the news of Chicago for that day that they gave out, like they sold as you got on the train. That way you could read it on your way home. Now that you can get your news on your phone, people oftentimes don't do it. But a lot of people don't like to, even in cities, pull out their phones on mass transit. And so a lot of times they do still sell these weekly papers. People will buy them before they get on the train, 30 minutes. They flip through it. They get done. They set it down. Somebody else picks it up. And those actually are highly popular. And they have a very specific market. People who commute to work and are getting off at 5 or 6 o'clock and want to read the newspaper, and that's a highly sought after market for advertising, which is where they make their money.